The world's most strategic maritime corridor is still under unprecedented pressure. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has slowed to a near standstill. A ceasefire exists on paper in Lebanon, yet violations continue. At sea, military presence is intensifying, vessels are being intercepted, and accusations of piracy are being exchanged. But beyond the headlines, a deeper question emerges. Are we witnessing a war in everything but name, or the gradual erosion of the rules that were meant to govern it? The answers in a bit with our guests. Hello there and welcome back again. So to help us understand both the legal and geopolitical dimensions of this crisis, I'm joined tonight by two distinguished guests. Fadi Hashim, lawyer and lecturer at the University of Beirut. Thank you for accepting our invite.
Thank you for having me.
Most welcome. And we also have with us tonight Sasha Shabra, political analyst and commentator. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me back.
Always a pleasure, Sasha. Let us perhaps begin with you, Fadi, with the legal framework shaping the whole situation. So, under international law, can Iran legally restrict or control navigation through the Strait of Hormuz?
So this is a question that everyone has been asking, and a question that has been going on online through and has been answered so far by multiple scholars around the world. Mm-hmm. The short answer is that under international law, Iran cannot legally close, suspend, or functionally obstruct navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, especially for neutral commercial shipping. It's very important to understand that the Strait of Hormuz is an international strait. It connects major maritime zones and is essential for global navigation and energy trade. Under the law of the sea, which is an international legal system, standalone legal system operating under the big international law umbrella, ships and aircraft of all countries enjoy the right of transit passage through international straits. This means that the passage cannot be suspended or impeded by the coastal state. However, Iran can regulate certain matters related to safety, navigation, pollution, taking care, maintenance of and security within its water. But these regulations cannot have effects on blocking the passage. And this is the difference that needs to be met. There is something that is a difference between legitimate regulation and coercive obstruction. And therefore, we can say that if Iran lays mines, threatens ships, seizes vessels, fires commercial traffic, as is happening today, this is definitely coercive obstruction and is not a legitimate regulation under international law whatsoever. So the legal point is that Iran and USA or any other party participating in this conflict cannot transform an international strait into a political or military bargaining tool because everyone else around the world is suffering. And not just the countries at hand, everyone else. And we'll talk about that further during tonight.
Probably deal with this, and since we're talking about this, maybe Mr. Sasha, moving from the legal framework of this matter to the strategic reality on the ground, it is affecting everybody. So is it what we're seeing today, an escalation of tensions or calculated use of the Strait of Hormuz as leverage, like he just mentioned? Are they using it as a tool?
Well, I would say in a sense, it's not an escalation of tensions. It's actually as you suggested, a tool and as a way to avoid non-kinetic or avoid using war to get the aims that each side wants. I think we've seen very clearly that neither side really wants to continue this war. Iran has taken a lot of damage. The U.S. has used up a good deal of its munitions, and the U.S. allies in the region are quite exposed. And I think we see the Gulf states have been very happy to get back to a sense of normalcy. Of course, where does this leave things is that the remaining pressure point is the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran is seeing that they have an immense amount of leverage here. And the U.S. has no strategy to actually counter that. You'll note that the American response here has been to put another blockade on the strait, which doesn't make a lot of sense from a strategic point of view if you want the strait to be open. So I think we'll see that the Iranians do hold most of the cards here, As the previous guest has said, there's no legal framework,
Yes.
but at the end of the day, the legal framework doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. The legal framework, it doesn't matter. We've seen them exchanging, accusations of piracy around the Strait of Hormuz, one obstructing things, the other one seizing tankers. And that's what I want to ask you about, Mr. Hashim. At what point does the control of over a maritime zone or a strait cross the line into an unlawful blockade under international law? We have seen the UN Security Council moving towards the direction of condemning Iranian attacks. And there was a resolution adopted, the resolution 2817, but that was regarding the attacks on Gulf states as well.
Yeah, so the first part of the question is actually very important. A blockade is not simply any form of maritime control. Under the law of naval warfare, a blockade is a specific method of warfare with strict legal conditions. It must be declared, notified, effective, applied impartially, and limited to lawful military objectives. It must also respect humanitarian rules, which is something that we're actually not seeing any of during this conflict. So if a state controls a maritime area, patrols it, or inspects vessels in a certain circumstance, this does not automatically mean that there is a blockade. But when effect of the measures is to prevent ships from entering or leaving a coast, port, or maritime zone, we enter a blockade territory. A blockade becomes illegal, as we are seeing today, as it does not meet the conditions required by international law. For example, if it's not formally declared, and that we have not seen. If it's not effective, and that's also we have not seen. If it is applied selectively, and that also from the side of Iran we have seen that some ships have been allowed passage while others have not. And this has been definitely a purely political decision, which is also illegal. And if it targets neutral shipping without a valid basis, and as you said, a lot of ships have been targeted, civilian ones have been targeted, this is also legally problematic. So the Strait of Hormuz, as I said in the beginning, is a very sensitive because it's a natural international strait. And blocking is not the same as blocking an enemy port like the US is doing. A blockade of an enemy port may in some circumstances be lawful under international law, and we're going to talk about that in a few. But the blockade of this specific strait is definitely using international law and all of its tools, specifically for political bargain that the whole world is going in as a victim of it at the point.
The whole world is being a victim of the blockade or the controlling of Iran of the Strait of Hormuz and what is happening around the Strait of Hormuz. Sasha, beyond the legal definitions, there is a question of power projection at sea. We're seeing, or how do you see who is effectively shaping the current balance? Iran through the pressure in the Strait of Hormuz, or the United States through its naval presence in the region?
What we've seen here is the absolute victory of asymmetric warfare and asymmetric platforms in controlling these contested spaces. So for all the firepower that the U.S. has, I mean, the U.S. Navy is the most powerful in the world by a long shot. It can project power of immense capabilities all over the world. But we've seen for all that power, all that firepower, the U.S. is unable to take control of the strait. It's unable to even get into the strait. You'll see that the U.S.'s major capital ships, the aircraft carriers, and all, they're in the Arabian Sea. They're further afield because of the the efficacy of the Iranian platforms. These massive amounts of drones and ballistic missiles, and also their fast boats, or the mosquito fleet as they're called. They're quite deadly and they're quite effective, even if one of these platforms is quite small compared to top-of-the-line American fighter jet or cruise missile. The Iranians simply have so many, and often they're slow, or they're flying so low that traditional tools that have been designed for countering much larger platforms like fighter jets don't work. So we've seen quite the success of the Iranian defensive tactic. They're fighting on their home territory. They have hundreds and hundreds of miles of coastline to operate from. And at the end of the day, that's the side that's always going to win in this type of situation. Short of a ground invasion and actually taking control of land, there's simply no way to wrest control of the strait away from Iran.
How do you interpret today's statements of Trump? You're speaking about the tactics and everything. He's basically bringing this up again, and he's saying that he has defeated Iran militarily and will never allow it to obtain the nuclear weapons.
Well, Trump is not someone who's going to say that he's been defeated by Iran, or even if he has been defeated, he's going to try to look for a victory. And I think this is, an opening for the Iranians or others to find some agreement. I don't know what that agreement is yet. Part of the problem is that Trump's negotiating team often seem to have different priorities than he does. When Kushner and Witkoff, who are essentially working from the Israeli position, are handling the negotiations, they're going from a different point of view than Trump or perhaps J.D. Vance are looking for. So we still don't know what these off-ramps are, but we know there's a very, very clear indication Trump would like this to end. He has a good sense for domestic politics. He has a good sense for the things people care about, which are high gas prices, high oil prices, the major chaos in the world economy. This is impacting Asia to a large degree, and he'd like to make sure his summit with Xi Jinping goes forward very smoothly next month. So Trump understands there are a lot of reasons to shut it down, but he doesn't seem to be able to figure out what he needs to do to reach an agreement with the Iranians. And I don't see any conclusion to this that doesn't leave the Iranians with de facto control of the strait and the ability to charge tolls as a form of reparations for the war.
No agreements to be seen yet, according to you. Hashem, on what legal basis, back to our topic, can a naval blockade or vessel interception be justified in this very specific context, in a legal perspective?
From a legal perspective, there is a clear legal basis where the United States can board or seize vessels. They have some legal ground that they need to navigate on to be able to do this. But these grounds are very thin ice, and these are very limited and certainly not being used as they are now. It cannot simply board or seize neutral commercial vessels merely because they pass through the Strait of Hormuz or they have paid a fee to Iran, even though they're doing this under pressure, but no one is saying this clearly. Only if the United States has credible evidence that a vessel is carrying weapons, military equipment, sanctioned oil, dual-use goods directly destined for the Iranian military to be used in this conflict or is participating in sanction evasion, it may claim a legal basis to inspect, diverse, or in some cases seize the vessel. But the key point here is that everything that is being done without legal basis because it's based on suspicion. No one in this conflict, neither of the parties, has provided any proof so far that they are seizing any vessels or conducting any military actions based on evidence. And suspicion cannot be vague in this case. The vessels cannot be treated as unlawful simply because they are Iranian linked or simply because they are passing through the Hormuz Strait or because they have paid a toll demanded by Iran. So neutral merchant vessels have specific protections under international law, which are not being respected at the moment. So short answer is the United States can act, but there are very strict conditions set by international law. And we start talking about erosion of international law when these conditions are actually not met or not respected.
Mr. Shabra, do you see the confrontation remaining contained at the sea, or there is a risk of a broader regional escalation? We've been watching what is happening for now more than 2 months. What is to expect in the couple next weeks or days? We don't know how much longer is that going to last.
Well, as I've mentioned many times on this program, ultimately that's going to be decided based on the Americans' ability to constrain the Israelis. I think the Americans would like to keep this limited, but we've seen time and time again, Israel would like to expand this to a larger war. And I believe I mentioned last time on the program that, the path to a ceasefire runs through Lebanon. If, the Iranians have made it clear that that's part of the ceasefire, and the Israelis have made it clear that they'd like to keep escalating there. Including, quite in violation of international law, if you've seen the activities they've been doing there. I will say there is sort of an unprecedented statement by President Trump just this week when he mentioned that he had prohibited Israel from attacking Lebanon.
Yes.
Now, as we've seen, they're continuing to attack Lebanon.
Maybe we will tackle
yes.
the Lebanese front in a couple of minutes. Please keep
Yes.
that point, and we can talk about it in just a minute. Hashim, maybe legally speaking, what defines piracy under international law, and can state naval actions ever fall under that definition? We have seen Iran and the US trading accusations of piracy around the Strait of Hormuz. So the UN ambassador, or the US ambassador to the UN, said indiscriminate planting of mines in international water mines that makes Iran an international criminal and pirates of the Strait. We have also seen the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations accusing the US of carrying out piracy-style seizures of Iranian oil tankers. But can you explain how this falls under the legal definitions?
Yes, thank you. I think the worst thing that can happen in any conflict is when parties start throwing accusations at each other that are profoundly unfounded. Piracy, it's good that we're talking about this, because piracy has a very specific legal meaning in the legal system. It's not simply any lawful seizure of a ship. Under Article 101 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, piracy requires illegal acts of violence, detention, or depredation committed for private ends by the crew or passengers of a private ship or private aircraft, and usually on the high seas or outside the jurisdiction of any state. This we have to discuss this definition because it's very important. First, the act must be committed by private actors, not normally by a state navy. So therefore, Iran cannot be accused of piracy. Second, it must be for private ends, such as ransom, theft, or private gain. Third, it usually must occur outside the territorial jurisdiction of the state, which is not the case of the Strait of Hormuz. This is why acts carried out by the state navy under government orders are generally not piracy in the technical legal sense of the word. Of course, everything about this conflict has been so far very much political and very less legal. They were not saying that piracy or the acts happening are lawful. They are unlawful and they violate the UN Charter. They may amount to aggression even. But at this case, there is one important exception. Under the article said, it's very important that if the crew of a warship or a government ship mutinizes and takes control of the vessel, their act can be assimilated to piracy, which is what they're trying to assimilate at the moment. But this is a very specific situation, and it does not apply when the Navy is acting under the authority of the state. So it's a very confusing act, but also it's a typical political use of legal terms to try and throw accusations at the international level, especially at the Security Council.
Mr. Sasha Shabra, your take on those wrong uses, according to our legal expert, of piracy and legal terms for political ends. How do you interpret all of those discourses that we're hearing every day in the news?
Look, I mean, at the end of the day, international law isn't worth the paper it's written on. And I mean, I would say just in the case of the UN law on the sea, none of the states party to this conflict have actually ratified the convention. So I think we can all dream of a world where there are these rules and everyone follows it, and UNCLOS, the law of the sea, is something that governs all of the maritime rules. But the U.S. never ratified it. Iran has never ratified it. So at the end of the day, we're sort of talking about a hypothetical that doesn't exist, and that's just one example of international law. And if we do want to get into the validity of the law of the sea as a legal framework, plenty of other countries have developed their own frameworks. Look at the Dardanelles and the Montreux Convention that governs that in Turkey. That's viewed as an exception, but it's a result of power. The Turks can shut down the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus anytime they want, so they get their exception to use a specific convention. And that was the result of war. So I think it's more than likely that we'll end up in some new de facto international law where Iran gets their own exception to run the Strait of Hormuz, whether that's on paper or that's simply the result of for the next decade, everyone going through is going to be paying a payment to the Iranians and being issued some sort of transit permit. But at the end of the day, as I said, international law, as we've seen, doesn't really exist. International law governs, transiting international waters. It also, covers warfare, and there's all sorts of provisions under the Geneva Conventions on not targeting civilians, on not targeting civilian infrastructure. And we've seen in the U.S.-Australia campaign against Iran and also against Lebanon, not even to speak of Gaza. There's simply no respect in today's world for international law. So we can dream of it, we can talk about it, but these are all hypotheticals, and they simply don't reflect the world that we live in today.
So the international law is not being respected. Hashem, does the absence of a formal declaration of war, changes how these operations are legally classified? Because I believe that it is different when you declare a war and then act with your enemy in a way, and when it is not declared under law.
Yeah, it's very important, and I would like to here we always come back to international law, and even if we're really disappointed at international law, I would say us legal practitioners around the world, there's a big disappointment that to continue about the idea that Sasha started. It's a dream. International law is a dream, but we really want it to be more than a dream. We want it to be something that we aspire to apply, and something that we will keep fighting for. To go back to the question, no, it's not really the way people think. Modern international law does not require a formal declaration of war, does not require the president to go on TV and say we are declaring war for the law of armed conflict to apply. The key question is not whether the state have formally declared war against each other. The key question is whether there is, in fact, an international armed conflict between these states. Under the Geneva Conventions and the law of armed conflict, an international armed conflict starts and exists when there is resorting to armed force between the states. And we have seen a lot of armed force between the two states. So the conflict definitely started, the armed conflict definitely started even without the declaration. And this is very important because states today often avoid declaring war and they use terms like preventive action, self-defense operation, security measure, blockade, interdiction, military operation, counter-proliferation action. And these all labels are some ways that they use to avoid the application of international humanitarian law and laws of the war. But they do apply from the second the first attack is launched. And the Geneva Convention very much govern the conflict from the pinpoint of its start.
Mr. Sasha, could this crisis accelerate a broader geopolitical realignment, especially around energy security and maritime control?
I think absolutely. For so long, the status quo has existed where the Gulf has supplied so much of the world's energy, and it's been secured by the U.S. security umbrella. And we've seen both of those things are collapsing now. The ability of the Gulf states to supply so much of the world's energy, and in particular LNG, where there's a disproportionate amount coming from the Gulf states, particularly Qatar. And the U.S. security umbrella is not turning out to be what it used to be. In fact, it's been a liability for a lot of these states. So I think we will see countries, particularly in Asia, shifting how they align themselves in terms of their own energy security, but we'll also see a lot of rethinking of what it means to be under the U.S. security umbrella. We'll see that in Asia. just as in Europe, just as a result of this, Trump has threatened to kick Spain out of NATO. There's not really a mechanism for it the way he's outlined it, but that's quite significant that over something that's actually quite a small aspect of this conflict, which is Spain refusing access to their air bases to attack Iran, Trump is threatening to sort of upend all of NATO. I don't think NATO kicking out Spain would lead to the survival of NATO as an institution. So that's a huge aspect of it. We'll see in Asia a lot of questioning about even countries under the U.S. security umbrella, such as Korea, Japan, Taiwan, are suffering from energy security issues. And certainly the Gulf will start moving towards China and alternative sources of security over time. So I don't think we'll see a complete reshaping of the world and a rendering of all current alliances. But the previous world we have been in is changing, and states are going to be thinking much more in terms of what they can secure on their own terms.
Maybe turning to the other developments in the region very quickly, Hashim. When ceasefires such as the one in Lebanon are repeatedly violated, how does international law assess their validity, and especially how to reinforce international law in 30 seconds in cases where the ceasefires are violated?
I mean, unfortunately, and especially in the case of Lebanon, the ceasefires are violated every day. We are, as lawyers, urging Lebanon every day to recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court as the only international body realistically capable of holding actors accountable in this case. We praise the efforts of the Lebanese government, clearly resorting to diplomacy on the international level and in every way possible, and holding back to not engaging in any possible warfare that would escalate the situation further. But there remains the concern. Israel is not really respecting the ceasefire at no fronts. Ceasefire breaches are happening every day. Drones are flying over Beirut as we speak. So this is a very complex situation, but this is why, more than ever, we urge the Security Council and the International Criminal Court, but therefore Lebanon needs to recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court for justice to be able to happen.
So maybe as a last question to Shaber, just to speak about Lebanon, can we consider it today as a separate conflict or part of the same interconnected regional pressure system? Because we've seen Iran saying that the ceasefire or Iran is also part of their conditions in the plan that was proposed.
Well, I think you can see it. It's both part of it and it's not part of it, and that it's clearly part of the war. It's this conflict, this front has emerged as an aspect of the war, and the Iranians have been clear they want to get a ceasefire there as well. But at the end of the day, Israeli goals are quite different in Lebanon than they are in Iran. There's an intent to destroy Iran militarily. There's an intent to deal with Iran's ability to project power on the region. But if you look at the actions of Israel in southern Lebanon in particular, it looks much closer to their policies towards Palestinian territory and the West Bank and in Gaza. This is much more of a long-term plan, likely of occupation, of settling, and of cultural destruction in those regions. So there are clearly two sets of goals operating there. But I think we have to view the short-term linkage of those fronts, and Iran seems to be doing what they can to try to help Lebanon in that situation. So it will remain to be seen if the U.S. can keep those linked, because ultimately it'll come down to whether the U.S. pressures Israel to pull out of Lebanon or not.
Thank you very much to you both, Sasha and Hashim, for your valuable insights and time. Thank you very much, and thank you, dear viewers, for following this edition, and see you in the next one.
See you.